a modest brick row home on North Marshall Street. Sunlight glints off its windows. A tricycle rusts in the yard. Neighbors wave to the man who mows his lawn every Sunday. But beneath that ordinary facade, down a narrow staircase behind a bolted door, the air reeks of urine and burnt flesh. A pit, dug into cold concrete, lined with chains. A generator rigged to shock screaming mouths silent. This is where Gary Heidnik, a man who quoted proverbs and hosted church meetings in his living room, buried his darkest secret. 6 women, imprisoned like animals, tortured for months, all in the name of a deranged mission to birth a new world order. The twisted irony? His victims were those society refused to see: runaways, sex workers, women battling addiction. Heidnik didn't hunt in alleys. He offered them shelter, a warm meal, a handshake, and once they crossed his threshold, they vanished into a labyrinth of suffering 20 feet below the clatter of dinner plates and hymns. But this story isn't just about the horrors that unfolded in that basement. It's about the masks evil wears, the way it thrives in plain sight, cloaked in charisma, piety, even pity. Gary Heidnik wasn't a shadowy stranger. He was a veteran, a father, a man who donated to charities. And by the time Philadelphia police pried open that cellar door, 2 women were dead, their bodies dismembered and baked into casseroles, fed to the surviving captives. While Heidnik calmly told officers, "I think you'll find what you're looking for downstairs." This is the chilling truth. Monsters don't live under your bed. They live next door. And their greatest weapon isn't a knife, it's your trust. We're taught to trust certain faces. A soldier, a man of God, a father. Gary Heidnik wore all 3 like a disguise. But peel back the layers and you'll find a blueprint for madness, drafted long before the basement, the chains, the screams. Because monsters aren't born in a day. They're built. Born in 1943, Gary's childhood was a cracked mirror of normalcy. A strict, abusive father who beat him for minor mistakes. A mother who vanished into mental institutions. By 17, he enlisted in the army, not out of patriotism, but escape. Yet even there, cracks formed. He'd later tell psychiatrists about hallucinations. God's voice guided me to save the world. After his discharge, Heidnik masterminded a new persona. He founded the United Church of the Ministries of God in Cleveland, preaching to a handful of followers. But this wasn't faith, it was a pyramid scheme. He amassed over $500,000 by manipulating vulnerable congregants, draining their savings while quoting Luke 6 verse 38, "Give, and it will be given to you." Then came the delusions. Convinced he was a modern-day Noah, Gary believed God commanded him to repopulate Earth after an impending apocalypse. His ark? A Philadelphia row home. His flock? Women he deemed genetically ideal. Though in reality, they were marginalized, desperate, and invisible to society. But here's the twist. Heidnik wasn't a raving lunatic. He hosted barbecues, joked with neighbors, even won custody of his estranged daughter by charming a family court judge. Psychiatrists would later debate whether he was schizophrenic, a narcissist, or a sociopath. But one thing was clear, his mission wasn't random. It was calculated, cold. He studied electrical engineering, stockpiling generators and wiring. He built soundproof walls. He even rehearsed his kidnapping methods, first on a sex worker named Sandra Lindsay, who escaped, only for Heidnik to refine his tactics. By 1986, his church had no congregation, just a cellar. And in that cellar, Gary Heidnik finally became the god he'd always pretended to be. You've heard of monsters, but Gary Heidnik didn't lurk in closets or under beds. He built his evil from scratch, a labyrinth of wires, chains, and rotting mattresses, a place where time stopped and humanity dissolved. This is the story of the dungeon he designed, a house of horrors hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of a Philadelphia neighborhood, a place where survival meant obeying a man who believed he was God, or becoming another corpse in his twisted experiment. It started with a promise, a warm meal, a bed, a chance to escape the streets. In 1986, Philadelphia's vulnerable women, many battling addiction, poverty, or abuse, found themselves drawn to Gary Heidnik's offers of salvation. He'd cruise the streets in his blue Cadillac, handing out cash, sandwiches, and Bible verses. His voice was calm. His eyes crinkled when he smiled. To them, he wasn't a predator. He was a lifeline. But the moment they stepped into his row home on North Marshall Street, the doors locked behind them. Down a narrow staircase, behind a reinforced steel door, lay Heidnik's masterpiece. A soundproof basement divided into 2 pits. One was a shallow grave dug into the floor, lined with plastic tarps. The other was a wooden box, barely larger than a coffin, where women were forced to kneel for hours. Chains bolted to the walls. A makeshift electric chair, wired to a car battery. And a stench so thick, it clung to their skin like a second layer of filth. Heidnik didn't just want prisoners. He wanted disciples. His first victim was 24-year-old Josefina Rivera, a sex worker struggling to stay sober. He promised her shelter. Instead, he threw her into the pit and shackled her ankles. "Call me master," he demanded. When she refused, he pressed a cattle prod to her ribs. The jolt sent her convulsing against the concrete. "You belong to me now," he said, "and God wants you to suffer." But Josefina was just the beginning. Over the next 5 months, Heidnik kidnapped 5 more women: Sandra Lindsay, Lisa Thomas, Jacqueline Askins, Agnes Adams, and Deborah Dudley. Some were lured with cash. Others were snatched at gunpoint. All were thrown into the basement, where Heidnik's rules were simple: obey or be punished. The punishments were diabolical. Heidnik, a former army electrician, rigged a network of wires to the basement floor. If a woman misbehaved, crying too loudly, refusing to eat, daring to curse his name, he'd force her to stand barefoot on the electrified metal plates. The voltage would surge, searing their feet, leaving blisters that oozed for weeks. Other times, he'd dunk their heads into buckets of freezing water until they gagged, laughing as they gasped for air. But his favorite tool was psychological torture. He starved them for days, then tossed raw hamburger meat into the pit, watching as they scrambled like animals. He forced them to watch as he raped the others, insisting it was God's work to create his new race. And when one woman, Deborah Dudley, begged for mercy, Heidnik dragged her upstairs, shot her in the head, and calmly returned to the basement with a shovel. "Clean up the mess," he told the others. The worst was his replacement policy. When one woman died, whether from torture, starvation, or sheer despair, Heidnik would drag her corpse upstairs, dismember it with a hacksaw, and bury the pieces in the backyard. Then he'd drive back to the streets, hunting for her replacement. "God needs a perfect flock," he'd tell the surviving women. "If you disappoint me, you'll end up in the ground too." But even in hell, sparks of defiance flickered. Sandra Lindsay, the second victim, became an unlikely leader. When Heidnik forgot to lock the chains one night, she crawled to the kitchen, stealing bread and raw eggs to feed the others. She whispered plans of escape, even as Heidnik shocked her for talking too much. Another captive, Lisa Thomas, clawed at the basement walls until her fingers bled, desperate to scratch through the soundproofing. Yet the true turning point came from Josefina Rivera, the woman Heidnik thought he'd broken. After months of torture, Josefina realized survival meant playing his game. She praised his divine mission. She laughed at his jokes. She even agreed to help him kidnap new victims, earning brief moments of freedom. But it was all an act. On December 26, 1986, Heidnik took Josefina to a mall, ordering her to lure another woman to the car. Instead, she sprinted to a payphone, dialed 911, and uttered 5 chilling words. "He's going to kill us." When police arrived at Heidnik's home, they found a man sipping coffee at the kitchen table. "I think you'll find what you're looking for downstairs," he said, eerily calm. What they discovered defied belief. 2 women, Lisa Thomas and Jacqueline Askins, were chained to the walls, their bodies covered in burns and bruises. In the backyard, officers unearthed the remains of Deborah Dudley and Sandra Lindsay, their bones mingled with garbage. The basement, walls were stained with blood, feces, and scratch marks from fingernails. And in the center of it all stood Heidnik's electric chair, wires still dangling like spiderwebs. But perhaps the most haunting detail? Upstairs, the house looked normal. A sofa with floral cushions, a Bible on the coffee table, family photos smiling from the walls. The contrast was so jarring, one officer later said, it was like walking from heaven into hell and back again. Heidnik's dungeon wasn't just a crime scene. It was a testament to human depravity and resilience. The women who survived didn't just endure torture. They outsmarted a man who thought he was untouchable. They became witnesses, testifying against him in court, ensuring his madness wouldn't claim another life. Yet the question lingers. How many screams were swallowed by those soundproof walls? How many times did neighbors walk past that house, oblivious to the nightmares beneath their feet? Gary Heidnik's basement is gone now. Torn down, the ground paved over as if to bury the memory. But evil leaves echoes. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear them, in the creak of a floorboard, the hum of a wire, or the silence that follows a question we're too afraid to ask. What's hiding behind the smile of someone we think we know? We talk about monsters. We dissect their motives, their methods, their madness. But what about the ones who stared into the abyss and fought back? This isn't just Gary Heidnik's story. It belongs to the women he tried to break, the ones who turned survival into an act of rebellion. Because even in a soundproof hell, hope is a whisper that refuses to die. Sandra Lindsay didn't look like a hero. At 24, she was battling addiction, drifting through Philadelphia's streets, when Heidnik offered her a sandwich and a ride. Hours later, she was naked, chained to a wall in a pitch-black pit, her ankles raw from shackles. But Sandra had survived worse than Heidnik. She'd endured abusive relationships, homelessness, a system that treated her as disposable. And so, when Heidnik threw her into that basement, she made a silent vow. "I will outlast you." Her first act of defiance was small. One night, Heidnik forgot to lock her chains. Sandra waited until his footsteps faded upstairs, then crawled through the darkness. She found a bag of bread crusts in the kitchen, stale and moldy, and smuggled them back to the basement. When the other women wept, she pressed scraps into their hands. "Eat," she whispered. "We're getting out of here." But Heidnik noticed the missing food. He dragged Sandra to his makeshift electric chair, clamping wires to her toes. "You think you're clever?" he sneered, cranking the voltage until her body spasmed. Yet even as she screamed, Sandra smiled. Because she'd planted a seed in the others: resist. Steal. Survive. Meanwhile, Josefina Rivera was playing a dangerous game. Heidnik's first victim. Josefina had been trapped in the basement for months. She'd been starved, electrocuted, forced to watch as Heidnik dismembered Deborah Dudley's body. But Josefina noticed something. Heidnik craved validation. So she gave it to him. "You're right, master," she told him one day, her voice trembling. "The world is evil, but you're a prophet." Heidnik's eyes lit up. Slowly, Josefina became his favorite. She praised his sermons. She laughed at his jokes. She even agreed to help him recruit new followers. Heidnik began taking her on drives, testing her loyalty. Each time, Josefina smiled, waved at strangers, and plotted. On Christmas Day 1986, Heidnik made a mistake. He took Josefina to a diner, bragging about his plans to kidnap more women. Josefina nodded, sipping her coffee, then excused herself to the bathroom. Inside, she scribbled a note on a napkin. "Call police. 3520 North Marshall Street, women trapped in basement." She slipped it to a waitress, begging with her eyes. But the waitress crumpled it, fearing a prank. Josefina didn't give up. Days later, Heidnik brought her to a shopping mall, ordering her to lure another victim. Instead, Josefina bolted to a payphone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "His name is Gary Heidnik," she hissed. "He's got women chained in his basement. He's going to kill us all." Back at the house, Lisa Thomas and Jacqueline Askins felt the shift. With Sandra and Josefina gone, Sandra to a shallow grave, Josefina to freedom, Heidnik grew paranoid. He ranted about police, checked the locks hourly, and starved the women for days. But Lisa, a quiet 19-year-old with a poet's soul, whispered to Jacqueline, "He's scared." "That means we're close." They were right. On December 26, 1986, officers stormed Heidnik's home. He greeted them calmly, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. "Check the basement," he said, almost bored. What they found would leave hardened detectives vomiting in the yard. Lisa and Jacqueline were curled in the pit, their bodies skeletal, skin mottled with burns. In the backyard, officers unearthed Sandra's remains, along with Deborah Dudley's skull. But the true horror was the basement itself, a maze of wires, blood-stained tools, and scratch marks on the walls where fingernails had clawed for freedom. Yet amid the carnage, investigators found something Heidnik never expected: proof of the women's courage. Hidden under a mattress, they discovered Sandra's secret stash, a rusted spoon she'd used to dig at the concrete floor. In the wooden coffin, Lisa had scratched a single word into the wood: living. And in Heidnik's own journals, he'd written frustrated entries about Josefina. "She's too clever. I should have killed her sooner." The survivors' fight wasn't over. At Heidnik's trial, Sandra's family expected a broken woman. Instead, she took the stand, her voice steady as she described stealing food, distracting Heidnik, keeping the others alive. He thought he was God, she told the jury, but he couldn't even control a bunch of junkies and whores. Josefina's testimony was colder. She detailed every rape, every shock, every night she'd plotted her escape. When Heidnik's lawyer accused her of lying for attention, she leaned into the microphone and said, "You want to know what's true? I'm here. He's there. The courtroom burst into applause. In the end, Heidnik's victims became his judges. Lisa and Jacqueline rebuilt their lives in silence. Lisa became a nurse, specializing in trauma care. Jacqueline, though haunted by nightmares, raised 3 children, teaching them to trust your gut, even when someone seems nice. Sandra relapsed twice but found sobriety in her 40s, counseling homeless women. And Josefina? She vanished, changed her name, never spoke publicly again. But her 911 call still exists in police archives, a 3-minute recording of shaky breaths and gritted teeth. The operator asks, "Is he still in the house?" Josefina pauses, then whispers, "Yes, and he'll kill them if you don't hurry." Today, the survivor's legacy isn't just about surviving Heidnik. It's about the lies evil tells itself, that the vulnerable are weak, that cruelty erases courage, that chains can kill the human spirit. These women proved otherwise. They turned a tomb into a battleground. They weaponized crumbs, whispers, and fake smiles. And in doing so, they didn't just escape a monster. They outsmarted the devil himself. A courtroom isn't just a place for justice. Sometimes it's a stage. And in 1987, Gary Heidnik turned his trial into a circus, smirking at grieving families, quoting Bible verses like punchlines, and arguing he deserved a discount on prison time. But beneath the theatrics lurked a question that split psychiatrists, outraged the public, and still haunts us today. Was Heidnik a madman or the ultimate con artist? The trial began on June 22, 1987. Philadelphia's courthouse swarmed with reporters, survivors, and protesters clutching signs. "Burn the devil." Heidnik, however, strutted in wearing a crisp suit, grinning like a game show host. When the judge asked if he understood the charges, murder, kidnapping, rape, he shrugged. "I plead guilty to being smarter than everyone here." His antics were relentless. He interrupted witnesses to correct their grammar. He scribbled get-out-of-jail-free cards on napkins, sliding them to the judge. When prosecutors described how he'd starved his victims, Heidnik snapped. "They weren't starved. I gave them dog food. That's a balanced meal." The gallery erupted. Victims' families wept. Heidnik laughed. But the real battle wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the minds of the experts. Defense psychiatrists claimed Heidnik was schizophrenic. They cited his delusions. God commanded him to breed a new race. His victims were disciples. The basement was a church. One doctor testified. He genuinely believed he was saving humanity. Prosecutors fired back with a tape recording. Weeks before the trial, Heidnik had called a news station from jail, demanding airtime to preach his message. On the tape, his voice was calm, calculating. "I'm not crazy. I'm a businessman. Those women, investments. If they'd obeyed, we'd all be rich." The jury listened, stone-faced. Then came the survivors. Sandra Lindsay took the stand, her hands trembling as she described stealing bread to keep the others alive. When Heidnik's lawyer sneered, "Isn't it true you're just a drug addict looking for fame?" Sandra leaned forward. "You want to know what's true? I'm here. 2 of my friends are dead. And he," she pointed at Heidnik, "still thinks this is a joke." The gallery erupted in applause. Even the judge didn't stop them. But the trial's most haunting moment came from an unlikely source. Heidnik himself. Against his lawyer's advice, he took the stand. For hours, he rambled about biblical prophecies, stock market tips, and his brilliant basement engineering. When asked why he killed Deborah Dudley, he paused, then said, "She annoyed me. Like a mosquito. You ever sweat a mosquito?" A juror later confessed. "That's when I knew. He wasn't insane. He was empty." On July 1, 1987, the jury deliberated for just 5 hours. Guilty on all counts. Death by lethal injection. Heidnik's response? "I'll be out in 6 months. Watch." But the debate raged on. Was he a lunatic lost in delusions? Or a manipulator who weaponized insanity as his final con? Even the psychiatrists couldn't agree. Dr. Paul Spears, a defense expert, admitted under oath, "He's either the sickest man I've ever met or the best actor." The public wasn't conflicted. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered the verdict. Talk shows branded Heidnik the real-life Hannibal Lecter. But the survivors felt no victory. Sandra Lindsay told a reporter, "Hanging him won't unbreak us. It just means he'll never hurt anyone else." Heidnik, meanwhile, thrived in prison. He filed endless appeals, demanding a new trial, a TV in his cell, even a last meal of lobster and ice cream. 12 years before his execution date, he wrote bizarre letters to politicians, claiming he'd invented a cure for AIDS. And in 1999, when guards finally led him to the death chamber, his last words were pure Heidnik. I'd like to thank myself for being such a fascinating defendant. Yet long after his death, the questions remain. Can evil ever be explained, or only condemned? Was Heidnik's Bible-thumping, calculator-toting persona a symptom of madness, or a shield to hide behind? Even the jurors struggled. One confessed, "I voted to kill him." But part of me wonders if we played right into his game. Perhaps the answer lies in the survivors. Lisa Thomas, asked years later if she believed Heidnik was insane, said flatly, "Does it matter? Insane people feel remorse." He didn't. Josefina Rivera, tracked down by a journalist in 2005, had one line: "Evil doesn't need a reason. It just needs a chance." Gary Heidnik's trial wasn't just about justice. It was a mirror held up to society's darkest curiosities. Our hunger to dissect monsters, to label them, to convince ourselves we're nothing like them. But in the end, the only verdict that matters belongs to the women he tried to erase. They lived. He didn't. We bury the places where evil happens. We tear them down, pave them over, build something bright where darkness once festered. But erasing a house doesn't erase the truth. Because Gary Heidnik's story isn't about a place. It's about the lies we tell ourselves to sleep at night. That monsters are easy to spot. That evil announces itself with a snarl, not a smile. And the most terrifying question of all, what if we're wrong? In 1997, the city of Philadelphia demolished 3520 North Marshall Street. Bulldozers reduced Heidnik's row home to rubble. Neighbors cheered as the wrecking ball swung. "Good riddance," one muttered. The lot was paved into a community garden. Children play there now. Tulips bloom where chains once bit into flesh. But you can't bury a ghost. For years after the trial, locals claimed they heard screams drifting from the empty lot. Others swore they saw Heidnik's face in their windows at night. But most just stopped talking about it. "It was easier to pretend it never happened," said a former neighbor who'd once borrowed sugar from Heidnik. "We didn't want to admit we'd missed it, that any of us could have missed it." Yet the question's nah. How did no one hear the screams? The basement was soundproofed, yes, but Heidnik often left victims unshackled while he ran errands. One woman, Agnes Adams, escaped in November 1986. She staggered down Marshall Street, naked and bleeding, pounding on doors. A neighbor later told police, "I thought she was a drunk. I closed the blinds." Agnes was dead within weeks, her body fed to the others. And what of Heidnik's ex-wife? Betty Brossler, who divorced him years earlier, knew he'd been institutionalized twice for kidnapping her. She'd warned authorities he was dangerous. They dismissed her. "He's just eccentric," a social worker said. Even the justice system faltered. After his 1987 death sentence, Heidnik became a perverse celebrity. He received fan mail. A punk band wrote a song glorifying his crimes. Tabloids paid inmates for exclusive interviews about his jailhouse antics. Meanwhile, survivors like Sandra Lindsay fought to afford therapy. "The world cared more about him than us," she said in a rare 1995 interview. "Like we were just props in his story." But stories have a way of resurrecting. In 2003, a college psychology class stumbled onto Heidnik's case. Students debated, was he born evil or broken by childhood trauma? The discussion went viral online, spawning documentaries, podcasts, and Reddit threads dissecting his motives. True crime enthusiasts prowled Marshall Street, snapping selfies by the garden. "It's like they want to taste the horror," said a survivor's daughter. "But they don't want to know the real people he hurt." The survivors, meanwhile, carved lives from the wreckage. Lisa Thomas became a nurse, specializing in trauma care. "I help people Heidnik would have preyed on," she said. Jacqueline Askins raised 3 sons, teaching them to see the invisible people. Sandra Lindsay relapsed twice but found sobriety at 47, working at a shelter. "I tell the women there, you're not disposable. Heidnik thought we were." Proved him wrong. Only Josefina Rivera vanished completely. After the trial, she changed her name, moved overseas, and severed all ties. In 2010, a journalist tracked her to a small European village. She refused to speak but handed him a note. "Survival isn't a victory. It's a life sentence." Heidnik's legacy, though, thrives in shadows. In 2018, a true crime podcast episode on Heidnik sparked an unsettling trend. Listeners confessed they'd admire his intelligence, if not for the murders. That same year, a man in Ohio was arrested for keeping 5 women chained in his basement. His defense? "I was inspired by Heidnik, but I wouldn't have killed them. The parallels chill. Both men targeted marginalized women. Both used charm to disarm. Both believed their cruelty had a higher purpose." and both lived in neighborhoods where nobody suspected a thing until the screams broke through. So why does this story cling to us? Because it forces us to confront an ugly truth. Monsters don't wear masks. They wear our faces. They volunteer at food banks. They coach Little League. They quote scripture and mow their lawns and wave as you pass by. And when they invite you inside, you go, because evil isn't a stranger. It's the neighbor who reminds you to bring in your trash cans. Philadelphia's garden blooms every spring. Kids laugh where victims once begged for death. But dig 6 feet down and you'll hit concrete dust, the last fragments of Heidnik's house. The city never removed the foundation. Too costly, they claimed, or maybe some secrets refused to stay buried. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of the dark. We say evil is a shadow, a stranger, a thing that hunts in the night. But Gary Heidnik's story isn't a ghost story. It's a funeral hymn for the lie we all want to believe. It couldn't happen here. Not to me. Because the truth is far more terrifying. Evil doesn't need fangs. It needs a handshake, a smile, an invitation. Gary Heidnik died on July 6, 1999. The execution was clinical, sterile. He lay on a gurney in a Pennsylvania prison, IVs dripping poison into his veins. His last meal? A bucket of fried chicken ignored. His last words? A joke only he laughed at. No mourners attended his burial. No headstone marks his grave. Just an unmarked plot in a prison cemetery where weeds claw through cracked soil. But evil doesn't die. It metastasizes. Heidnik's name still slithers through true crime forums, documentaries, and hushed coffee shop conversations. We dissect his crimes like lab specimens, the basement, the Bible, the bodies, searching for a reason. A flaw in his brain, a scar from his childhood, a missing puzzle piece that explains how a man could kneel in church on Sunday and torture women on Monday. But what if there's no puzzle? What if Heidnik's greatest horror isn't what he did, but how easily he did it? How he weaponized trust, the one currency we never think to guard. He didn't stalk his victims in alleys. He drove them home. He didn't silence them with threats. He handed them a Bible. And when the world finally saw his face, it wasn't a monster staring back. It was ours. Today, survivors still walk among us. Lisa Thomas, the quiet poet chained in Heidnik's pit, now works night shifts at a hospice, holding the hands of the dying. I used to think death was the worst thing, she says. But it's not. It's the people who make you wish for death. Sandra Lindsay, who stole bread to keep the others alive, runs a shelter for homeless women. I tell them, you're not trash. You're seeds. And seeds grow in the dark. And somewhere in the world, Josefina Rivera tends a garden under a name that isn't hers. She grows roses, thick, blood-red blooms that thrive in silence. They are the answer to Heidnik's madness. He wanted to erase them, reduce them to footnotes in his deranged gospel. But they became hymns, proof that resilience is a quiet, unkillable thing. So why does this story claw at us? Because it's not about Heidnik. It's about the neighbor who offers to fix your sink, the coworker who stays late just to chat, the preacher who prays a little too loudly. We want to believe the worst people are nothing like us, that we'd spot the monster before it strikes. But Heidnik's legacy is a funeral shroud over that lie. He taught us that evil isn't a what, it's a who. And the only thing separating the ordinary from the abyss is a choice, a moment of cruelty, a decision to lock the door and swallow the key. We tear down houses, we burn monsters, but the real work isn't in the grand gestures. It's in the whispers, the gut feeling that something's wrong, the courage to knock on a neighbor's door, the choice to see the invisible. Gary Heidnik's story isn't a warning about monsters. It's a warning about us. Stay wary, stay kind, and never forget the loudest evils die in the light. But the quiet ones, they're already pouring you a cup of coffee, listening, waiting, smiling,